Well, welcome to this opportunity that I have to be chatting with Dr. Jerry Root. Dr. Root is from Southern California. He's a graduate of Wheaton College, Biola University's grad school, got a Ph.D. from the Oxford Center for Mission Studies. He is the emeritus professor at Wheaton College. He is a senior fellow at the C.S. Lewis Institute, the author of numerous articles and books on evangelism and apologetics, and, of course, C.S. Lewis. His works on that front include C.S. Lewis and the Problem of Evil, The Neglected C.S. Lewis, The Quotable C.S. Lewis, and most recently, The Surprising Imagination of C.S. Lewis. Dr. Root has lectured on C.S. Lewis in close to 80 universities in 19 countries. On top of that, he has 4 married children, 15 grandchildren, and he spent time skydiving and swimming with the sharks. And he played football, so I am told, until he was 44. And during college, never fumbled or had a run in which you lost a yard.
I gained every play.
Okay. So have you heard from the Chicago Bears?
No, their coaches were short-sighted in their ability to judge talent.
Well, I mentioned in the sermon this Sunday that we can't, in spite of what everybody says, we can't do anything we set our mind to. I said, you can't fly, and I go, and it appears now unlikely that an NFL team is going to ask me to quarterback them. So a member of the Bears, McCaskey family, who owns the Bears, said, Mike, I didn't realize that you were hoping for a call. He goes, I hope you're not bitter. And I said, well.
That was Pat McCaskey.
That was Pat McCaskey.
I
yes.
know Pat.
Okay, well, he's apparently not going to give me a tryout,
Really?
but I'm not bitter over it. So, look, I am thankful for this opportunity, and I am going to take advantage of this to ask not only the responsible questions, but then my questions. So I had a chance 5-6 years ago. I was at Oxford, and I arranged to go visit the kilns. I'd not been. And I got there early. And I'm talking with the tour guide, and we're sitting in the living room. And after about 15 minutes, he said, oh, look, the other 5 people that were going to be part of this tour have just canceled. They were all coming together, and they've all canceled. So it's just you. And I was scared he was going to cancel it. But he said, so you get to ask whatever questions you want to ask. And so I had a great 2 hours and I sort of see this as the same opportunity. You've been reading C.S. Lewis for 50 years, teaching him for 40 years. And so, yeah.
54 years now and teaching him for 44.
Okay, well.
Yeah.
I have questions, but
my mind is like a pickle soaking in the brine of C.S. Lewis.
That's a good thing. I mean, you win. I think if I could go back, I might want to be Jerry Root and study C.S. Lewis.
Oscar Wilde said, "Be yourself. Everybody else is already taken."
Okay, well, fair enough. But it occurred to me, you're reading C.S. Lewis, and I'm going to faculty meetings and elder meetings and budget meetings and staff meetings. And you had to go to faculty meetings. Those are their own kind of bad.
And I had to grade papers.
Okay.
And the other thing, though, too, is that Lewis opens more than wardrobe doors. If you're going to really immerse yourself in Lewis, you're going to want to read the books he refers to also. So he's a liberal arts education in himself. He takes you everywhere.
Yep. Well, so let me ask some basic questions that I suspect some people would want to ask you. What C.S. Lewis book do you recommend most often, and what C.S. Lewis book is your favorite?
I usually ask the person several questions before I recommend a book to them, because I want to find out where their interests are. If they don't have a philosophical mind and I recommend The Abolition of Man, I'm going to lose them. If they're a person who's interested in fiction or something like that, then I want to find out what kind of fiction. Fantasy, science fiction, novels, whatever. And I usually try to direct what I would recommend to them by virtue of that. If they say, well, I just want a taste of Lewis, just want an introduction to him, I say, then read The Great Divorce, because it will give you a feel for his fiction. It will give you a feel for some of his big ideas, but I also tell them people will sometimes take liberty with their fictions. You don't want to press too hard on some of his big ideas by virtue of that book, but it's a brilliant book, and it's a good introduction. You can read it in an evening.
So do you have a favorite?
My favorite Lewis book is whichever one I'm reading at that moment.
Okay.
And I've read them all over. And I think the least I've read any of his books is 6 times.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, when people ask me what my favorite book of the Bible is, I say whichever one I'm studying at the moment.
That's
because
good.
it just keeps giving.
We're on the same page.
How do you think, or in what ways do you think modern 21st century evangelicals get Lewis wrong? So I heard somebody say, this was 20 years ago, they said, if C.S. Lewis showed up today, I mean, he's a relatively disheveled academic who, smoked cigarettes and went to the pub. And at the time, those were sort of scandalous things in the evangelical world, less so today. But they said most evangelicals are not prepared to meet the real C.S. Lewis. Agree? Disagree?
I don't know. I think he was an engaging person who was approachable. Once in a while, you'd hear a person say that they thought he was off-putting, but usually that person had done something obnoxious in his presence. I think that when people say, if Lewis was alive today, what would he say? You usually get instead what that person projects on Lewis, and they use him like a ventriloquist uses his dummy. I don't think we can say that necessarily. But if we look at the challenges of our culture, we could say, did Lewis say anything about challenges that were similar in his own day that could have segue or application for today? And I think that he would start pounding the drum on things related to the abolition of man and related to that hideous strength, which is so pressing. This is way ahead of time. And the biggest thing is, I think the evangelical church, in many quarters, not all, I get around and I see great churches and good things going on everywhere. But I also see some who are slipping on issues of the sexual challenges of our day, sexual identity of our day. They have a friend who's caught up in something, and so they can't make a committed judgment about that thing. And I tell them, you need to be like Jesus. He could say to the woman caught in adultery, neither do I condemn you, there's the love, but go your way and sin no more. There's the unwillingness to drop the standard. Right. He pulls truth and love together. And I think Lewis would address that. So truth is not reality. Truth is what I think about reality when I think accurately about it. This is a microphone. It's a true statement validated by the fact that there's a microphone there. This is an elephant, falsified by the fact that there's no elephant there. So we have this word symbol, and it means literally soon, with, in Greek, and balein, to cast. So you cast together two things, a word with an object. It's arbitrary at first to call this microphone. But once I settle on that symbol to describe this, I don't have to have one present to refer to, and I can now begin to talk about it in a way that somebody who doesn't see a microphone before them understands what I'm saying. So the word becomes so important, and it's validated by the reality that supports a claim. And we're at a place now where we don't understand that truth is what I think about reality when I think accurately about it, because we use words like whatever pronoun you want to use, whatever gender you want to use. And what happens at that point is communication breaks down because you don't have 2-3 people using the same word, meaning the same thing. And community breaks down when communication breaks down. And we end up at the Tower of Babel once again, which is kind of what Lewis concludes out of that hideous strength with that yep. too. And it ends up in the abolition of man.
I'm reading, I have about 200 pages, maybe 100 pages left in that hideous strength. I've read it before, but I am reading it again in preparation for the class. So, and I do think, so I taught on Lewis 20 years ago. And I've been away from Lewis scholarship for 20 years. And coming back, I've had several surprises. One is, that he wrote, although he's been dead for 60 years, another 10 books came out. I mean, I have not read everything Lewis wrote, let alone 6 times. But I'm just surprised that he keeps coming out with books. That was a surprise. Secondly, I was surprised at how many people have done advanced work on Lewis, such as you have. And I also was surprised to see how many people were talking about the abolition of man. Mm-hmm. That is, and not mostly Christians, but some secular people saying, yeah, this is, this guy was prescient. He, more than Aldous Huxley, more than, 1984, more than whatever, Lewis was onto something here.
It's interesting that the abolition of man was included by Mortimer Adler, the philosopher, in the great books of the Western world in 1968. So he had elevated it to the level of Plato and Aristotle, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and so on. And it is very good. And I don't think it would have been as necessary if people would not have lost touch with the intellectual past, the richness of the intellectual past. Things are always changing, culture's fluid, but there is a solid skeletal structure to sound thinking. And it has always been in place. And Lewis makes that case even in The Abolition of Man, says this isn't a Western concept. The appendix of The Abolition of Man, he's showing quotes from Eastern work,
right,
Western work, ancient work, relatively recent work, to show that this concept of objectivity is so necessary. He says in another work, all judgments imply a standard. If I don't have a transcendent standard or an objective standard, right, then I end up in chaos. If a contractor wants to build a building in New York and he gets his design from an architect in California, they're operating by a transcendent standard of feet and yards and so on and measurement so they could build a legitimate house. What's the standard if I reject objective standard? It becomes utterly self-referential, utterly anarchistic. Unless I can get a party to join me, then it becomes tyrannical. It becomes something right, that destroys culture. And Lewis is writing about this, and it's so important. I think that's why people are going to Abolition of Man right now. I think it's central to Lewis's big ideas, and he himself thought it was one of his 3 best books. Okay,
so I want to ask my questions. I'm going to stay with some of the basic questions. Is there an area in which you think Lewis was wrong?
Yeah, I think he was wrong in his understanding of inspiration of Scripture. He believed that the Bible was an authoritative book, but he believed it was a book that had errors. And he put it this way, it makes sense what he believed. He wasn't nonsensical, but I disagree with him. He felt that Jesus, the incarnate Christ, in his humanity could have made a non-moral error, could have stubbed his toe on a rock. He could have hit his thumb with a hammer in the carpentry shop. Non-moral, but it was a human error. Maybe he could have made a mistake in his math, but not moral mistake. And he felt that the biblical authors could have engaged in mistakes that were non-moral in their humanity, but at the place of inspiration, it was authoritative. And that's the way he looked at it. I would disagree, but when you get something like the mustard seed is the smallest seed, well, we know it's not the smallest seed, but was that person making a moral judgment that was morally insufficient? That's the way Lewis, I disagree. I think that there's other ways we can understand this. So that would be one. You want more?
I'll take one more.
Okay, now I've got to go through the Rolodex and find one.
Well, I've got one.
Okay, go ahead.
I read at one point Lewis was rejecting the doctrine of total depravity, but he was describing utter depravity. And that's sort of inside baseball for a theologian, and he wasn't trained as a theologian, but I wanted to say, oh, wow. Jack, you got this wrong. No, I agree with you. Nobody wants to see utter depravity. And utter depravity just means that we're as bad as we could be. Total depravity means every area of our life has been affected by sin, and we're as bad off in that sense as we could be.
I know the passage in Lewis where he says this, but the thing that's interesting to me, he knew Calvin. So he actually had read Calvin. I know people, they talk about total depravity of God, and when I start talking to them, I say, that doesn't sound quite the way I remember reading it. Tell me where you got that. So for Calvin even says, when he's talking about man's fallenness and so on, he doesn't believe that a fallen man is incapable of good. When I started first grade, 1/3 of my first grade class were in polio braces. An atheist physician named Jonas Salk cured polio. Nobody's in polio. Eradicated the disease. Wouldn't even take a patent for it because he wanted the cure to go out fast. I think that was a fundamentally good act, but it wasn't a salvifically meritorious act. And when Calvin talks about total depravity, or talks about, he uses other terms for it as well, but when he talks about the depravity of man, he's not saying man is not capable of good. Man's made in the image of God. There's all kinds of good we're capable of. We're not capable of anything of salvific merit, and we can't do anything to save ourselves.
So was Lewis disagreeing with Calvin on that point?
I think Lewis was where you described it, utterly depraved. If we were utterly depraved, we would never know we were depraved, is the way Lewis put it. So I think your description of Lewis's position was an accurate one, and I think he was wrong at that point. I think you're right.
Okay. Well,
but it wasn't that he had not read Calvin, interestingly enough. A lot of people make judgments about books, and they've never read the books, and Lewis wasn't that.
No. So has studying Lewis, you're saying you've been studying him for over 50 years, 54 years, and teaching him for 44. Have there been moments where he was so good that it just was, discouraging to you? Like, oh my goodness, I just can't get there?
Never discouraging. Never discouraging. And the reason why is I don't know very much. I believe I'm a pea brain. And I don't think anybody knows very much. You go to Harvard, and the Widener Library has 19 million volumes under that one roof. And I'll meet somebody who says, I'm an atheist. I said, I'll bet I can prove to you in 5 minutes you're not. And I've had people say, try. And 5 minutes later, they're not atheists. They admit they're agnostic. Because I say, C.S. Lewis said, negative knowledge is harder to prove than positive knowledge. For me to say there's no spider in this room, I'd have to check every nook and cranny.
Right.
To see one, I could see one scurrying across the floor. Arguments for God's existence are more complex than seeing a spider scurry across the floor, but the image still has validity that negative knowledge is hard to prove. And I say to this atheist, can you tell me, of those 19 million volumes at the Widener Library, there's nothing in any of them that counts against what you think? I don't think you have the capacity to tell me that. And I think I would trust you more if you were an honest agnostic rather than a dishonest atheist. And they always change. I talk with Madeline Murray O'Hare. I talked with her once for an hour, just the two of us, one-on-one. She wasn't an atheist any more than you or I are. She said, I'm a promiscuous woman. I choose promiscuity over belief in any God. So it was a moral choice.
Yeah. Well, I am thrilled with Lewis, love reading Lewis, profit from Lewis. I remember 35 years ago reading something and going, will I ever write one sentence is as good as, the sentences that are on every page of it? His ability to capture truth and make it simple was so good.
Don't be intimidated by it. Don't ever be intimidated by what you don't know. And don't be intimidated by saying, I don't know if I'll ever be able to do that, because that keeps you on the stretch. If you want to write like that, you can grow and develop. Here's one thing for Lewis, though, in his writing. First off, he was steeped in an understanding of classical languages. Mm-hmm. So he knew the derivative words from which we get our English words, and he knew specifically what word to use in a particular instance. Second, he trained as a poet. So he learned how to economize his use of words. And consequently, though his poetry wasn't widely accepted, it still gave him a great practice in writing. And I think anybody who would want to write like Lewis could start in those areas. They could learn languages well. One of his best friends was Tolkien, who was a philologist. They would discuss languages. He wrote one book called Studies on Words, where he looks at the etymologies of words and how those words are used and so on. And then, again, his poetry training. Set your hand to writing and poetry, use some economy of words, and then take it into your prose, and you'll start moving in a good direction. But I'm never intimidated by what I don't know. I'm intrigued by it, and I want to learn more.
Well, intimidated might be not in light of Lewis picking exactly the right word. I may not even have the right word there. I am in awe of his capacity, and he seems to excel. I mean, this was another surprise coming back to Lewis. It's not just that he excels as a fiction writer and as a nonfiction writer in Christian theology or related topics. He also writes as a scholar in English and in medieval philosophy and medieval. And now, what I realized as I was trying to outline this class, I'm like, oh my goodness, there's all these books now. Shadowlands. I just went to see the Freud movie last.
That was good.
Yeah.
Freud's last session.
And then you've got all this intrigue about, the Inklings and his near death in World War I and his friendship with Tolkien. And it's like people are fascinated with his life. So you now, there's like 4 categories of things to talk about Lewis in. It's different kinds of writing and his life. They're all fascinating.
They are, and uniquely fascinating. But also it should make us mindful of the fact that every person we meet is fascinating. So I like novels, but the novelist always gives you a narrative thread. And he or she are basically leading you along that narrative thread. Humans are more interesting than the best of novels because they're not a narrative thread, they're a fabric of threads. And you can follow this thread, then you can follow that thread, and then this one that cross purposes with that one, so on. Lewis is intriguing because he was thoughtful, and he also had a remarkable output, so there's much to study about him even after he's passed. But every person you meet, even as he says, there are no ordinary people.
Right.
You've never met a mere mortal. And our obligation, the weight of glory, is on us to try and nudge each person towards becoming more of an everlasting glory and less of an everlasting horror. It's fascinating, isn't it? I love it.
So you mentioned that you think you mentioned something. You said this is one of Lewis's big ideas. What do you think Lewis's big ideas are?
Well, his biggest idea is his biggest idea. You have to get to second because you have to understand for something of the big idea first. His biggest idea is that there's a reality out there that exists independent of my thoughts about it. It's an objective reality, and I need to learn about that reality and move in the realms of truth, not falsehood. And if there's a realm of opinion's based on probability rather than certainty. It's subject to doubt. Reasonable people could differ about matters of opinion. I need to be wise enough to be able to make the difference, understand the difference between truth and opinion, and even prejudice, where I'm making judgments and I really don't have anything that informs those judgments that makes them even probable. That is first. Second, and the second point is his biggest idea. There's 73 books out there. Lewis wrote 56 in his lifetime, and all the rest he wrote afterwards. No, they were collections of essays that were put together under common cover. His letters, there's 8 volumes of his letters and so on. But his biggest idea, I can take you to every book and show you where he either expresses it conceptually or expresses it explicitly. Reality is iconoclastic. Reality is iconoclastic. So an iconoclast breaks idols. So I have an image of God. Maybe I'm a member of your congregation. I hear you preach one Sunday, and I go, wow, some of the pieces of the puzzle have come together for me. I have a more robust image of God than I've ever had before. Late night discussion with friends, read a book, see a movie, whatever. And all the pieces of the puzzle are coming together. That image, when it comes together for me, is breathtaking. But if I hold too tightly to that present understanding, it will compete against my having a growing understanding. And that now has become an idol, and I won't let go of it. Reality is iconoclastic. Reality breaks the idol. C.S. Lewis says in Surprised by Joy, God is always kicking out the walls of temples we build for him because he wants to give us more of himself. And the theologian Walter Elwell used to say, all theology is approximation. What we seek in theology is better and better approximations. So Lewis isn't the only one who says this. There is Baron von Hugel, an author that he sometimes quotes, who said in his letters to his niece, Gwendolyn Green, beware of the first clarity. press on to the second clarity, third clarity. So sometimes we're going to encounter something that's going to say, I have to conceptually change my way of thinking. But a lot of times we come to things that are not going to change the way we think, but they're going to make our thinking more robust. We're going to add more rings to that thing. And Browning, go ahead. Maybe.
Well, I was going to say, I like that. If somebody had asked me what I thought Lewis's big ideas were, I would have said the first one. I would have said there is truth, there's objective reality, we have to deal with it, we have to follow truth, and he's brilliant at showing you that you haven't quite figured it out yet. And I certainly would agree that reality and God are bigger than our perceptions of it.
Remember Lucy? Aslan, you're bigger. Oh, no, child, I'm not. But every year you grow, you'll find me bigger.
Bigger, yes, yes. So a second thing I would have said is Lewis's perception of time always challenges me. Not just that he understands what has happened in the past better and is always challenging my chronological snobbery, but also in light of the way he thinks about eternity is also very, I think, positively disruptive to me. I'm intrigued by that. And the third thing I would say is he seems to think more clearly and interestingly and helpfully about evil than I do.
Maybe not more than you do. My guess is you're on the right track. Maybe he's thought about it in some of its applications further, but I'm sure at the core you guys would be on the exact same page. But I will say a couple of things though. All of the other ideas of Lewis you're going to get to because you've got this sense of objectivity. And Lewis also has a pretty profound approach to epistemology, how you can validate what you're thinking about reality. Is it accurate or does it need modification? His ideas of longing and the recognition of the heart questing for something, it's a huge idea too, but you're never going to sort it out if you don't get back to, again, the idea of truth and objectivity. But the one on time is intriguing to me. And I can tell you the source for Lewis's thinking on that. He wrote The Discarded Image, which is his book on the medieval worldview. And he would try to read all these books and then abstract from them. So a student would take into the reading of a medieval book a medieval understanding of that world rather than projecting onto the 21st century, or in his day, a 20th century value. He said the most influential book on medieval literature, hands down, no contest even, was the Bible. But the second most influential was Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. Lewis gives a 16-page summary of that book in The Discarded Image. And if you read Dante, he's referring to it, Milton's referring to it, Chaucer's referring to it. Chaucer has, in Troilus and Cressida, Pander, one of the characters, recounts the entire book. And then you've also got Alfred the Great translated it. Queen Elizabeth I even did a translation of it. And he said a person wasn't considered educated up to 150 years ago, he said. So that'd be 210 years ago or so. If they didn't know that book, they weren't considered educated. We have people wrestle with foreknowledge and free will. If God foreknows what I'm going to do before I get there, how am I free when I get there? Lewis takes Boethius and answers that question in such a way that we say, why was I so stupid that I even had a problem with it? And a lot of it has to do with our anthropomorphizing God. God, besides being omnipotent, all-powerful, besides being all these things, he's also omnitemporal.
Right.
All moments are always in his perpetual now. So I see you shaking your head,
Yes. No, I remember that, like...
In Mere Christianity?
Well, I don't remember where I ran across it, but I just remember saying, oh yeah, if God is above time, then that sort of takes that problem away, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And all those... Where was that insight at 2:00 in the morning in seminary bull sessions where you're debating these things like we got to wrestle this down and we don't have that insight. So yes, that was a big breakthrough.
Part of it is we don't have that classical knowledge and that class. So I went to the bookstore when I read that in Lewis the first time back in the 1970s, and I go, you don't happen to have a copy of Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy, do you? Say, oh yeah, we got it right here on a shelf. And I'm thinking, who's writing today that 1,500 years from now their books? I read it. I've read it many times. It's one of my top 10 favorite books.
Oh.
And I think that I was using it in classes, in Christian formation and ministry classes at Wheaton, and one of the students wrote up about it in her philosophy class. And the chairman of the philosophy department read the paper and said, I like this. She wanted to meet with me for lunch. She started teaching a Boethius course at Wheaton College.
Okay, well, I'll add it to the reading list, which is long, but
you have time.
well, right. Well, okay. Yes. The not like God does, but yeah. So a couple of specific things here. I'm wondering, when we spoke a while back, you challenged. So I in terms of Mrs. Moore, I want to talk about Mrs. Moore for a second because it comes up in the class, and I initially studied Lewis with Earl Palmer. I don't know if you knew.
Oh, I knew Earl Palmer. Yeah,
So
one of my heroes.
Yeah. I took a class with Earl, a long time ago, and he said, people say this was, that Lewis and Mrs. Moore had a sexual relationship. Don't believe it. Not true.
He said that.
Good
for him.
And then I think he might have cited A.N. Wilson. I just came away that there was people saying that. And then, so I'm in that camp. And then I read Alistair McGrath's book and I go, oh, yeah, I think there was a relationship. Then you say, nope, don't go there. And I'm like, oh, okay, open topic again. And then just this week, First Things ran this article, and it said that Walter Hooper had this insight
Interview
from
with
Owen Barfield, and Barfield said that it was.
Yep.
So I'm not a Lewis scholar. I'm just quoting people who are writing about this.
I knew Hooper well and respected him highly.
Okay.
He gave the interview to Chris Mitchell, who was one of my best friends. He used to be the head of the Wade Center at Wheaton College. The thing is, what Hooper said, and I don't know why he said it, would never hold up in a court of law. Because Hooper says to Mitchell, so Hooper's dead.
Right.
So Mitchell can report this. Hooper said that Barfield said, and it would never hold up in a court of law.
Okay.
It's hearsay. So I've got better data than that.
Okay. So what's your better data?
And I met Barfield. I just met him once, but I knew Hooper well, and he had been in my home many times and so on. My better data is go back and read Lewis's journal that he kept at that time in his life. And there's several cases where he says, for example, he had a friend who did have an affair with an older woman. And Lewis is writing in his journal how stupid this guy is. Why is this guy doing this? Hardly the kind of thing a guy would write in his journal if he was doing that very thing himself.
And this is before Lewis became a Christ follower.
Before he was a Christ follower, but he still had standards. And then he talks about how he was teaching a class at Reading University, and it was not like an Oxford tutorial one-on-one. He was teaching a class, and there were co-eds in the class. And he said there were some really nice-looking women in that class. He said, I think it would be a difficult time for somebody who was born under a less temperate star than I was born under. This doesn't sound like a person who's carrying on an affair with another woman. And then there are several others, and if you read the journal, you're going to say, well, this certainly counts against it. And this is in Lewis's own hand at the time this was supposed to be going on.
So okay, I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm as I have read, when I read McGrath's book, I came away saying, oh, Lewis was more damaged by his mom and by World War I and by his dysfunctional relationship with his father. And his brother seems to maybe be struggling with alcoholism coming out of PTSD stuff from World War I. It just made it more plausible to me that pre-Christian Lewis was a more broken person than I thought. So maybe you just comment on that. It doesn't mean that he had an affair with Mrs. Moore, but...
Well, Lewis was a broken person, and you can find out about his own sense of his brokenness if you read something like Letters to Malcolm, Chiefly on Prayer, one of the last two books he produced before he died. And he's open and honest about this. Read Reflections on the Psalms, where he talks about human brokenness and his own personal awareness of it.
Well, he's got that great quote about when I first decided to take a look at my own heart, and it was a bedlam of lust and a
Yeah.
zoo of angry thoughts.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
It was shocking. So
Lewis seems pretty self-aware and so on. And I even think the pre-Christian Lewis was probably more self-aware than some people are who are Christians. You read his letters from his pre-Christian days, he's even quoting scripture in some of those letters. He knew his Bible. It wasn't a book. He was an honest academic. Even before he was a Christian, he was an honest academic. He knew that if you're going to study Western literature, you better know your Bible because it's
Right.
foundational to the stuff. And he did it, and so on. He didn't buy the message in it because there was a place where he finally becomes aware of his sin, and he finally becomes aware of his need, and he also becomes aware of the fact that this longing that had haunted him all of his life had an object, and God was the object, and he turns to Christ. Some of that stuff he describes even in Mere Christianity, the statements Jesus said that you just can't get away from. You've got to deal with these statements. It's either true, he's who he said he was, or he was a liar, or he was a lunatic.
Right. So, Jerry, so much I want to ask you. Okay, so let me pause before I jump to the next topic and talk about ask you about his conversion. So when I read Lewis, and you said, I think at some point that Lewis gave voice to the questions of your soul, or gave you a vocabulary of the soul, or something like that.
Surprised by Joy did that for me.
Yeah, and I mean, I remember, profound moments. I describe, a half dozen moments in my life where I'm reading something and the ideas are so powerful, and it's the light is coming out, and you're realizing something, and pieces are falling together, and it's just it's an emotional experience.
Yeah.
And I've had some of that with
Yeah.
Lewis, where you're
Yeah.
like, oh my goodness, he's explaining this, and he's putting together things, and I'm so obviously so drawn to that. When I read Lewis's Mere Christianity, talking about naturalism and the Tao, in I guess more, he's using that term more in Abolition of Man, but when he's talking about the way the world works, and he's talking so rationally about faith and about Jesus and the Lord, liar, lunatic argument, I got the impression that he comes to faith and has a largely intellectual conversion, which I don't think many people have. My experience as a pastor is that people come to faith when they're having an existential crisis, and it may be an internal existential crisis, or it may be because of cancer, or just a loss of everything. And what they need intellectually is permission to go forward. They need, this isn't mindless. And so the apologetics that I'm trying to do is to say, there's good reason for you to trust this. Like, I can't prove it, but you're not an idiot to go down this path. I don't see many intellectual conversions. I sort of operated under the assumption that Lewis had one. And now the more I'm reading and I go back to this conversation he has with Tolkien about, this is the true myth. And I go, was it an intellectual conversion? Was it a conversion of his imagination? How exactly does this guy come to faith?
Well, the one thing, there was a book that was done by Malcolm Muggeridge years ago called 20th Century Testimony. And the scholar who wrote the introduction to it said, when did Malcolm Muggeridge convert to faith? If you asked him, he'd probably say, do you mean when did I decide for Christ? Well, I made the decision to try and make every decision for Christ from now on. And I think what you're finding in Lewis is there are benchmark moments, but there are benchmark moments that had an unfolding that kept going on throughout his life. He even says in one place, after he'd been a Christian many years, I finally realized today I was able to forgive that man who hurt me at that school that I was at so long ago. In other words, there's another moment of kind of a conversion. But when he reads Phantastes by George MacDonald, he said his imagination was baptized. Now the rest of me took a lot longer, but something was changed. There was something converted, and I would suggest to you that what was converted at that moment was a willingness to admit there was something transcendent and supernatural that was out there. His materialism wasn't going to get it. And then he has the longing, and there's a place he writes about in Surprised by Joy. He calls the longing joy, and it's when he finally realizes that God was the object. He's in the sidecar of his brother's motorcycle on his way to the Whipsnade Zoo. He says, I started out, I wasn't a Christian. When I got there, I was.
Nothing happened on the ride.
Yeah. And then there were other places too where there were intellectual. So you could say, what are you as a human being? Are you a mere intellectual being? Are you a heartfelt being? Are you a soulish being? Are you a psychological being? My guess is that conversion eventually brings all of these things along, but usually happens a bit in piece at a time. And I think you'll find that in Lewis. And I think if you find it in Lewis, you can become a little more patient with yourself as you move along those lines as well. That was my experience, certainly. I didn't become a Christian because some slick argument convinced me of Christianity. I know some people who have, where all of a sudden they said, oh my word, I've got it all wrong. The moment of disequilibrium has come. I need to reject this stuff. It's false. It doesn't answer the questions that Christianity does. That's okay. I came to Christ because I knew I was messed up.
Yeah.
And I knew I needed Jesus in my life. And I knew I needed a love that was constant and not conditional. And it wasn't dependent upon my performance. And I needed to know that I was forgiven because I was hounded by the things I needed to be forgiven for. And that's why I came to Christ. I start reading Lewis pretty early on. And the reason why I was reading Lewis, my older sister was teaching fifth grade, and she was reading Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. She told me over dinner, I go, wow, this is intriguing. I read those books. I read Surprised by Joy. And then I was a college football player. You have to take it by faith now. And I made it my goal to share Jesus with every guy I played football with in college. And I led about 15 guys a year to Christ. There were about 60 guys who came to Christ over those years. They were asking questions. I had no clue what the answer to those questions were. But as I would dig for the answers, because I thought if that's the only obstacle keeping you from faith, I won't leave a stone unturned till I find out something. And I don't know if we ever get to the bottom of all these answers, but we get substantive answers, sure words that are helpful. Right. And consequently, then I'd go back to these friends, but I kept finding the reliable source that helped me was Lewis, and I was reading him voraciously. And a person wisely said to me at the end of college, you didn't get an education in college. You laid a foundation for one. Commencement means you will now commence your education. Pick an author who will take you places and make him your life study. Yep. And I pick Lewis. I think they could have said pick a composer, pick a art historian, pick an artist, pick a whatever, pick a country, pick a period of history or something like that. But I don't think I did badly picking Lewis.
Earl Palmer said in this class, like, you need to pick, you can be mentored by people who are dead if they've written a lot and you read them and then you start to think like they do. And so that was what pushed me towards thinking about Lewis. Yeah. And I've not done as much with it as I wish I had.
But not even thinking like him. You are a unique person. So you read Lewis, and it becomes one of the streams into the river of who you are as a person.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And Lewis takes you to other places and so on. The authors who I think are best are the ones that don't leave us stuck on that author, but the one who, like Lewis, opens more than just wardrobe doors for us.
Right. So I want to back up a half step. I was making this claim that I came across thinking Lewis was more damaged by the war or damaged by this difficult period of his life. And I don't want to suggest that he wasn't self-aware about that. And certainly in the movie with Freud, they play off of that. I thought the movie was good. It was very dialogue heavy. I mean, it's a play that's turned into a movie, and I thought Lewis comes off looking better than Freud, which I was glad for. I didn't know what was going to happen, but they play on the fact that Lewis in this, during the air raid, he's sort of having a flashback, and there's some unfinished healing that needs to go on. Somebody said to me a while ago that Lewis and Tolkien, along with Huxley and William Golding and Kurt Vonnegut, all these people that were severely injured in industrial war, all end up writing these accounts of the war as they're working it out, but none of them can write a nonfiction account. And so Vonnegut writes Slaughterhouse 5, and Golding writes Lord of the Ring, or Golding writes, Freiling writes about the island with the boys. Now, Lord of the Flies.
No, that's Golding.
That's Golding. Okay, so you've got Lord of the Rings, and you've got the Chronicles of Narnia, these epic struggles of good versus evil. And I guess I just would ask, do you think that, did Lewis write in a nonfiction way more than just what we got in Surprised by Joy about his experiences in the war? Was Warney, Lewis writes about Warney being on a bender or whatever. And I know that he had, it appears that he had some alcohol issues, Warney did. Am I right on that, or is McGrath pushing me down too dark of a path?
Well, the difficulty with McGrath's book, first off, he's an honest scholar. He read everything Lewis wrote
in order,
chronological order.
Yeah.
And that's what we know about McGrath. He's an honest scholar. And he's a brilliant writer. What he writes goes down smoothly. But I don't think that he understood some of the things that Lewis said. Because Lewis writes that when he wrote Surprised by Joy, for example, that he was writing a book. When a man writes a love sonnet, he not only loves a beloved, he also loves a sonnet. He wrote an essay, Sometimes Fairy Stories Say Best What Needs to Be Said. Lewis says an author wants to say something and he picks a literary form that helps him to say it well. Why did he write Surprised by Joy? He's very upfront at the beginning. I'm writing this to give an answer to those people who wondered how I moved from atheism to Christianity. That's his point. And he sticks with that point. And the things that are relevant to that point, he includes, and the things that aren't, he doesn't. And McGrath instead takes the things he doesn't include and begins to project on them. Why didn't Lewis write anything about this? What was going on there? And we end up getting the Lewis of McGrath's projection, not the Lewis who's really there. I wrote a response to that book for Christianity Today and tried to bring this stuff out. I've spoken at seminars with McGrath, and I don't want to in any way take away from his towering academic reputation and his capacities. But I know Lewis better than McGrath knows Lewis. And McGrath, who read him once all the way through, didn't read him and capture what Lewis was intending, especially with Surprised by Joy. And he says, Lewis is a good academic writer who says up front what he wants to do, as McGrath was with that book, in the sense that he says, I'm writing a biography of Lewis. Biographies are almost impossible to write. How many thoughts have you had today since you got up? Yeah. And how many of them have you processed with somebody else? And when you think of all the thoughts of a lifetime, we are mysteries to one another. We remain mysteries. We disclose some things remain hidden and whatnot. How do you write a biography?
Well, so I have many more questions, and we're just about out of time. So let me ask you my final 4 questions that I ask on podcasts of all sorts. So these are 4 rapid fire, quick questions. What, if anything, keeps you up at night?
Praying for people.
Okay.
I have a long list of people I pray for. I pray for about an hour every day, and I will not go to bed if I haven't prayed my prayers. I pray throughout the day too, but I have a very deliberate list of people I pray for. My heart breaks for them. My heart's concerned for them. My heart rejoices with them, and I pray for these people every day. That's what keeps me up at night.
Okay. What are you reading right now?
I'm rereading all of Lewis's literary critical essays. So I'm reading selected literary essays, and I'm reading his studies in medieval and Renaissance literature. Books I've read many times, but I just, it's been a while since I've read them. I want to make sure my mind's fresh on those areas.
What book or movie or podcast or Netflix show or Amazon product or whatever have you been recommending more in the last few years than anything else?
Well, one I use for an illustration is The Notebook. And I think I see some...
Like the Apple Notebook, or would
the Notebook, the movie.
Oh, okay.
There's a scene in there that's so powerful, and I believe it opens our hearts up to understanding the love of God dramatically. So I'll refer to that, and I refer to it fairly frequently. But if somebody says to me, what's the movie that touched you the most deeply? I always say Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump. And it would be a long explanation.
Okay. Well, what are you working on now? Are you writing another book? I mean, you recently came out with a book.
Yeah, well, the most recent one is called Splendor in the Dark, and it's a book on Lewis's book, Dimer. And I was really pleased because, I think it's an important poem, and most people don't read it because it was a pre-Christian book. But the Lewis estate said they wanted to publish Dimer with my book, so I can now say I published a book with Lewis.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
But what I'm working on now are two books that I've been working on for years, but every time somebody wants something, I set them aside because you always go with the one who wants over the one that you hope somebody will want. But I'm working on a book on Job. I've been working on it for over 50 years. And then the other one is a book on hell and the love of God. When you were in third grade, did you ever go to your third grade teacher's desk and see her arithmetic book open on her desk?
Maybe.
What do you speculate her book had in it that yours didn't have?
The answers.
Exactly. Here's a text.
Oh, yes, I do remember seeing that book. Yeah.
In love, he predestined us. Ephesians 1, 3, and 4. In love, he predestined us. Most people think of predestination as determinism. You'll never reconcile determinism with the love of God. So if you did your work and you came up with God's not loving because of determinism, you didn't get the answer that's in the textbook. You got to go back and work the theology till you find it compatible with the love of God. The doctrine of hell is like that. The doctrine of hell needs to be fully reconcilable with the love of God, and I'm working on trying to show how that's so.
Well,
so Job and hell.
Yeah, so
I'm living in a complete downer.
Well, let me ask that you get those two books done because I would like to read both of them. So
do you struggle with insomnia? I have the gift of healing. I cure insomniacs. And the only people who buy my books are anesthesiologists because they found they're cheaper to prescribe than the drugs.
Okay, than the drugs. Yeah. No, I do not struggle from insomnia. But both of those books, I look forward to reading those books. So, Dr. Root, thank you so much for
Please call
your time.
me Jerry.
Jerry, thank you.
My mother started it, and it's sort of stuck.
Your mother started it. Okay, well, Jerry, thank you for being on the podcast today.
Thank you.